What is up, and welcome back to another episode of the Wizards podcast. I'm your host, Greg Finberg, and in today's episode, we're going to be diving into what's next for this Wizards team. We've already gone past a lot of the major milestones of the offseason, whether it's the Wizards getting the number one pick in May's draft lottery, whether in June, it's them selecting AJ DeBonsa and Felix Okpara in the draft, whether it's July and free agency and signing a couple of guys, trading for guys like Ayton and Middleton, whether it's Summer League where DeBonsa looked awesome, some other players like Trey Johnson and Will Riley played well, or the latter part of the offseason where you just saw them make an along the margins trade to acquire Trey Mann and send out Cam Whitmore and Julian Reese. It's been a pretty busy and eventful offseason for the Wiz. They kind of have retooled and revitalized this roster while keeping the young core and also expanding to acquire some veterans, to sign other veterans like Trae Young to big extensions. It's been pretty busy for this team. And now you're kind of getting to this point in August and most of September where there probably won't be too much noise surrounding the team. But that's not to say that there isn't any more moves for Will Dawkins, Michael Winger, and this front office to make to round out this roster. And that doesn't mean that this offseason is now devoid of storylines. When training camp begins, there will be a lot more buzz and a lot more conversation surrounding this roster, and not necessarily from a construction standpoint, but more so from a, okay, now who's going to play and who's going to make the team? Is there going to be any cuts? What does the outlook for this roster look like entering what could be a very competitive season? There's a lot of that talk now. We're kind of shifting from the major offseason buzz to, okay, how does that reflect onto what we're going to see during the regular season? And in this pod, I'll try my best to break down kind of some of the moves that you should be expecting, some of the storylines to follow as training camp nears. The first thing is rounding out this roster. Like I mentioned, it's pretty much done. They have 14 standard contracts out of a possible 15. They have two-way spots out of a possible 3. They have done a lot to make sure that their roster is pretty much set in stone. Now, no one on this 14-man roster right now is in danger of getting cut or waived. It seems like the 14 standard guys that they have will be on this roster on opening night. What's left is finding that 15th player. Now, they don't necessarily have to do that anytime soon, but when you enter the NBA regular season, 99% of rosters have 15 players. And it's also finding someone on a two-way deal that you could bring in because you now have an open spot. As it pertains to the 15th roster spot, the Wizards were in a lot of rumors for veterans, former All-Stars, future Hall of Famers throughout the offseason, especially over the last couple of weeks. Notably, Russell Westbrook, who recently retired, ESPN reported that he held offers from the Kings and the Wizards offer being a 2-year deal, and he essentially retired. And I think the reasons they outlined was because he didn't like the role that the Wizards offered him. It wasn't a money thing. The Wizards have roughly $8.5 million in luxury tax space. They have the full $15 million non-taxpayer mid-level exception. For us, it wasn't about money. I think it was about role. I think the Wizards were probably like, look, you might play off the bench, but probably not because we have a decent bit of guards. We obviously have Trae Young who will start. We have solid depth at the wing position. We have other guys who are wings or forwards that can handle ball handling responsibilities. And I just don't think Russ wanted to sign up for that. And by all means, he's a Hall of Famer. He retired, a Hall of Famer and a legend. So he decided to pass on that deal. You obviously saw the Wizards also in on DeMar DeRozan. I think it was them, Miami, Denver, and Cleveland, as the team Shams reported, with some level of interest in DeRozan, who just signed for a vet minimum with Denver. Again, the Wizards could have offered DeMar not only the most money, but significantly more money. Like their roster is pretty much set. They could have offered him the $8.5 million in luxury tax space. They could have offered him whatever amount in the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, because you don't have to offer all 15 to someone. You can offer him $9 million instead of $6 million left over for another contract. So it was never about money for those two guys, despite the Wizards showing some level of interest. I don't know if they offered DeMar. I know they reportedly offered Russ, but both of those veterans decided to pass on the Wizards as a suitor. So now my guess is Washington's focusing or shifting its focus elsewhere. I think I maintained throughout the offseason that Anthony Gill has always kind of been on the back burner. He's always kind of been their fallback option. I'm sure he knows that and isn't too offended by it. But at the same time, this is a guy in Gill that I have heard has had significant interest from overseas teams. I've seen reports that have backed that claim that he has had interest from overseas teams, yet he hasn't signed deals when other notable NBA players have signed deals overseas. So I think the holdout is Gil probably wants to stay in DC. He wants to stay in the NBA with the Wiz. And he's kind of waiting to see, look, if you don't get any of your desired options, you want a 15th guy, I'm here. I'll sign for another vet minimum. And if you decide to go elsewhere, all right, maybe he has another offer from a team or maybe he goes overseas. But I think it's always kind of been, okay, plan B is Anthony Gill, and Anthony Gill's plan A is the Wizards. So they're kind of comfortable waiting for each other. And because they passed or missed on DeRozan and Russ, my guess is they bring Gill back. This isn't sourced in any way. I just think that a reunion is probably would be my guess. I wouldn't say it's likely, but out of all of the options on the open market, my guess is that Anthony Gill would be the guy that they decide to bring back. When you look at the free agent class, it's not like there's many big names. I think Jonathan Kuminga is like the best available free agent. Again, obviously that's not going to work here in Washington for both sides. And there's a bunch of other players. I saw reports earlier in the offseason that they had showed interest in Gabe Vincent. My guess is that is kind of waned, being that they just added Trey Mann via trade. So obviously they could still bring in another guard, but when you look at the roster right now, it's not like they have any major holes. Like before the Trey Mann trade, if you asked me, I would have told you, yeah, like backup guard, specifically backup point guard, they have a major hole. And now they added a combo guard, albeit not really a true point guard. Maybe some might think that they still have some sort of hole at backup point guard, but they clearly believe that they, for the time being, solved that. So I don't think guard is that big of an issue. You have four of them. You have four wings in Debonsa, George, Koulibaly, and Riley. You have three forwards in Davis, Champagnie, and Middleton, and then three centers with Sar, Ayton, and Vukcevic. I don't necessarily think you have any major holes or, okay, we really need depth at these positions. I mean, certainly looking at the fact that you have just three forwards compared to four wings and four guards, maybe that's where you look to add. But with this 15th spot, I think no matter the position, it doesn't necessarily affect the Wizards roster construction. Again, this 15th guy, you got to remember, is not going to play much, if at all, unless it's garbage time or unless you have a really, really, really injury depleted roster. So it's not necessarily, skill being the end all be all, I think, of this move. If that's the case, they could afford Gabe Vincent, then maybe they'd bring him in. To me, this is mainly about rounding out the roster with someone you think will fit with everyone on the court, but more specifically in the locker room. And I think Anthony Gill has proven that that is 1,000,000% him. A guy that probably won't play much, doesn't necessarily really care about that or his role, just knows that his job is to be a veteran mentor for some of these younger players, is to be one of the first people in the gym, last people to leave, and just be a great locker room presence. I think that's what you kind of want in your 15th man. And to me, Gill kind of checks those boxes, especially considering the Wizards don't necessarily need any specific position and this guy won't play much. I don't see why it's the biggest thing in the world if they just decide to end up with Gill in that spot. If I had to guess right now, I'd probably say that would be my guess. Um, Moving on to the open two-way spot, because again, they have an open roster spot, but also an open two-way spot. Because of the trade that they just made, they traded Julian Reese, who's on a two-way contract, to the Denver Nuggets. On the last pod, I didn't realize this until then. So when you're listening to that one, I wasn't really too sure why they decided to trade Julian Reese. But after some learning and my guy Jared on Twitter letting me know, there's something in the NBA called a touch rule that basically states if it's a 3-team trade or more, like a broader landscape, this one was a 5-team trade. Every team involved has to touch at least 2 teams. And a touch is just like some sort of transaction, whether I sent you a player or you sent me a player, you have to touch 2 teams. In this scenario, the Wizards touched the Cavaliers because they took on Trey Mann and that second round pick, and in return gave Cam Whitmore back to the Cavs. But that's only one team, and they needed to touch another team to make the contracts work. So that's why they sent Julian Reese to the Denver Nuggets. So both them and Denver could end up touching multiple teams in this deal. Very complex. I know it took me some time to understand, but that's why they had to send somebody out. And so originally my thinking was, oh, well, that's why they had to trade Julian Reese. Maybe they didn't want to, but they felt it was the opportunity cost was worth it, considering they'd get some guard help with Trey Mann and a second round pick. But then I was also alerted. I forget who mentioned it. So if you're listening, you know who you are. But one person commented that in that agreement, the Wizards could have just traded draft rights, and that also would satisfy the touch rule. And I'm pretty sure that is correct. So if that's the case, the Wizards, I believe, still maintain the draft rights to Yannick Nzosa. I know it's a blast from the past. One of the worst picks in modern NBA history. I know if you forget, it was a Tommy Shepard pick. I don't know if it was 2020 or 2021, but it was a draft and stash guy in like the 50s of the second round. And he literally didn't even he went down leagues. I don't know which league he was playing in, but he actually went backwards from the time the Wizards drafted him. It was never going to be a case where he came over to help the team, and just basically a waste of a pick. But they still own his draft rights. So I'm pretty sure the Wizards could have just sent Denver the draft rights to Yannick Nzosa to satisfy this touch rule. They didn't do that, which makes me believe, if all of what I just said is true, again, I'm not a cap guru. I'm just going off of what people have told me and some research I've done. If that's true, and they could have just satisfied the touch rule with draft rights, that tells me that they traded Julian Reese to open up that two-way spot. Not necessarily because they didn't like Julian Reese, but they were like, look, we got to trade someone anyway. Let's open up the two-way spot. So it's possible that they're eyeing somebody else. It's also possible that this is a lot to do with Jameer Watkins, who tore his ACL, is going to miss most of the season. That's the case. They're not going to cut Jameer Watkins. He's an awesome defender, was great in that summer league game. They just drafted him in the second round a year ago. Why would they just cut him and allow another team to scoop him up? My guess is they keep him on the two-way spot for the rest of the year. It sucks, but it's better than losing him for nothing. And if that's the case, you have Felix Okpara on the other two-way spot. You want to be able to have guys go up and back between two-way and the NBA if you need them, if there's injuries. And for the Wiz, if you only two players you have the ability to do that with are centers or bigger forwards, I'm not sure that necessarily helps if you have an injury at wing or at guard. And so what this makes me think is they were really thinking for this season, and that, look, they can't bring Julian Reese back on a two-way contract. I don't think they can sign him for about a year until his contract expires. And so now the Wizards are looking at, okay, they have an open two-way spot, and now they got to figure out what they want to do with it. I think Reese Beekman has been a pretty hot topic. I saw my guy Ben Strober at Locked On Wizards discuss the possibility of adding Reese. He was phenomenal in summer league, awesome on-ball defender, but also showed that he can knock down the three, which wasn't what he really showed in college, and showed that he's decently capable on that end. So maybe that's the guy they decide to bring in. Maybe it's an outside candidate. But if they do sign someone with that open two-way spot now, my guess it's a guard or it's a wing, somebody that gives you the flexibility of, okay, well, we have some injuries at the guard or wing positions. We can move this guy up from his two-way, and he can now be with the standard, or not the standard contract guys, but the main roster for these games. And if we need bigs, we obviously have Okpara that we're perfectly fine moving up. So if that's the case, then I think that's probably why they decided to move Julian Reese. Yes, to satisfy the touch rule, but I also think mainly to open up a two-way spot. And we'll see if they decide to fill that in the near future. Training camp is approaching. I believe for some teams it starts earlier if they have international games, but for the Wiz, I'm pretty sure the 29th is like everybody else, all 28 other teams start. So I'm pretty sure the 29th is when training camp starts for the Wiz. And the first day training camp starts is typically that morning is media day. So, media day is really fun. I went 2 years ago. I'll be back again this year. So that's really where you get all 15 standard roster players. I'm not sure if you get two ways. I don't believe so. Maybe you do. And you obviously, I think, get Coach Brian Keefe as well. And it's just an interview. It's 10 to 15 minutes, and You just kind of get to talk to all of them. It's a press conference and kind of see what they're thinking, feeling entering the season. It'll be the first chance to talk to Anthony Davis really since that press conference he did when the Wizards acquired him. There's been a lot of talk throughout, the rest of the offseason. It'll be the first chance to get to ask him questions as it pertains to his contract extension talks and what he's thinking about entering this season. Does he want to be in Washington? That'll be something I'm circling. You get to talk to AJ DeBonsa, which will be cool to see how he's feeling entering his rookie season. So that's something to look for in very late September. And then you'll have training camp and you'll have preseason, which starts October 8th, and all of that stuff. That's the first thing I wanted to get to in this episode, is talking about the final roster spot and talking about that open two-way spot now that they traded Julian Reese. A little bit more background as well as to why they decided to trade Julian Reese in that deal. The second half of this pod, I really wanted to get into some training camp battles. I know I'm probably jumping the gun. I mean, I got a month until training camp. But I've seen a lot of people discussing this on Twitter and in comment sections, and I've seen a lot of people ask me specifically what I think about Trey Mann versus Bub Carrington and what that'll look like in terms of the backup guard battle and who will play between, Champagnie and Riley. Is it going to be a 9 or 10-man rotation? This is why it'll be interesting, right? To talk to Brian Keefe and see what he's thinking, because he will be the one that decides whether they go 9 or 10 or 11 deep and who plays. It's a good problem to have, but it is something that is difficult and will definitely take him some time throughout training camp to decide. As it goes for competitions, and I say competitions lightly, again, like it's not, I just saw like Deshaun Watson's the Browns starting quarterback. I don't necessarily think it's specifically like that where specific positions are battling just 1v1. I think that's quite rare in the NBA, but it's more so who's going to get a spot in this 9 or 10-man rotation, whichever way that Brian Keefe goes. And that's kind of what I want to get to in the latter part of this pod. The first thing I want to get to before I even get into some of these competitions is how deep will Brian Keefe go with his rotations? It obviously has varied, and it's been pretty hard to place a finger on what Brian Keefe prefers, whether it's a 9 or 10-man rotation, whether sometimes he'll go 11 or 12 deep if needed. It seems like with all of his personnel, like just looking at the first 5 to 10 games of last season when, pretty much everyone, I guess, except for Bilal Coulibaly for the first couple of games was healthy. It seems like Brian Keefe prefers a 9-man rotation. You'll see sporadic minutes here and there, like a 5-minute burst for Anthony Gill or like a 7-minute stint early in the year for Will Riley when he really wasn't playing rotational minutes, or some sporadic minutes here and there for Champagnie. But for the most part, in terms of players that were playing, 17 to 20 or more minutes, there was, always 9 at least, or give or take 9 players that were doing that. And when I looked at those rotations, there wasn't a backup point guard. I mean, looking at last season, it was kind of by committee, to be fair, but they would start McCollum and Carrington as their backcourt, and then off the bench was Kispert, really, and that was like your lone guard. It wasn't necessarily, and he's kind of a forward. He could be 6'7". He could play both. That's just to say that they didn't just say, well, we need a backup for each position and we're going to go 10 deep. It seems like Brian Keefe is pretty content with leaving certain starters in longer in the beginning of games and kind of mismatching ball handlers with different units, because CJ would play some point and then you would have Bub play some point and you would kind of maybe have Keyshawn George play some point. And it was kind of by committee. You have Trae Young now and he'll be your starter, but you're going to need some minutes on ball from guys to give Trae a spell. And I don't know necessarily if they have that main backup point guard. Like when you saw with John Wall, it was like, okay, Tomas Satoransky is a pure point. He's backing him up, or Ramon Sessions or Andre Miller. I don't necessarily know if that's going to be the case for this Wizards team this season. It's, I think, a lot to do with personnel, but also a lot to do with just the preference of Brian Keefe. So in just maintaining this, I believe, this belief that I think Brian Keefe prefers a 9-man rotation, just looking at who I think is in that at the time being, I'd go Trae Young, AJ DeBonsa, Keyshawn George, Anthony Davis, Alex Sarr as my projected starting 5, and then Trey Johnson, Bilal Coulibaly, DeAndre Ayton as guys, as those 8 that I think are surefire. They will be in the rotation in some fashion, whether starting or coming off the bench. And then there's a real debate between Will Riley and Justin Champagnie for that backup forward spot. I'm sure Chris Middleton would like to have some say in that as well. I'm not sure if he will win that role, but it is a competition. And so when you're looking at it, I kind of view it as this, okay? And I'll try to break it down by position. When you look at point guard, it's very easy to think, okay, well, obviously Trae Young is going to start. That's probably the easiest thing on this roster to come out here in August and plainly state Trae Young will be the starting point guard. As it goes for the backup guard role, obviously this is going to be a competition between Carrington and Trey Mann. Really, the only other guys, they're combo guards, but also I'm sure could be labeled as point guards, and they'll battle it out in camp. If you really want a pure backup point, I'm not sure they're the best option, but maybe they're the best option on this team. And so that'll be some level of competition. What I'll say about that competition is I don't think the winner automatically gets 19 to 20 minutes a game and is the pure backup point. I very, very, very much could see a world where neither of those guys are really in the rotation. I could see a world where Brian Keefe just says, hey, look, we're going to use Keyshawn George as a ball handler. And if Riley is in the rotation, maybe we'll try to play him on ball sometimes, but it'll be by committee. Trae Young will play 30 to 35 minutes most nights. You just kind of need 12 to 15 minutes per game that you're allocating to someone to, kind of run the offense. And George has shown an ability to do so. Riley, not as much, but they played him at point in Summer League. I'm sure they would experiment with that during the season. You obviously have Carrington as well, but in my opinion, I wouldn't be surprised if Brian Keefe decides to sort of go away from Carrington and Mann early on and not just go 5 positions to start, 5 backups, and vice versa. I don't think that's the case or should be the case with this team. As for shooting guard, again, I don't know whether George or Coulibaly will start. If Coulibaly starts, then maybe he's considered more of a shooting guard than Debonsa, who's the bigger, taller player and could slide in at small forward. If George starts, I think George is better suited as a small forward, while the quicker, more agile Debonsa is more suited as a guard. So again, it could go either way. I'm just going to kind of go through this as if Keyshawn George is starting at the 3 and AJ Debonsa starting at the 2. You would have Debonsa as your starting shooting guard and Trey Johnson as your backup shooting guard. Again, it's possible that Trey Johnson starts at the 2 and Debonsa starts at the 3. You have George and Coulibaly off the bench. Again, this isn't a pod to really discuss the starting 5. I don't want to get into that. I already know that no matter what I say, it's just going to cause people to debate and be pretty upset with whatever I say. I'm going to leave that to whatever Brian Keefe decides. And if people are upset, then please direct it not at me because I'm not making the decisions. I'm just kind of going based off what I think will happen. And that would make Johnson the backup 2 guard and Debonsa the starting 2 guard. At small forward, you got Keyshawn George and Bilal Coulibaly. Again, doesn't matter who starts and who's backing up. I think that's kind of the tandem right there at the 3. And then at power forward is really where I think the biggest competition is. Because obviously I mentioned there's not really too many competitions in terms of actual minutes at shooting guard and small forward. I think Debonsa, Johnson, Coulibaly, George, those 4 will be the guys that play those 2 positions. Those competitions are more so for who will start versus who will come off the bench, not who will be in the rotation and not in the rotation. As it goes for backup point guard, Carrington and Mann is kind of who will be that backup point guard, but not necessarily does that mean that they're going to play meaningful minutes. When it comes to this one at power forward, particularly, I think Anthony Davis is the clear starter. He's obviously come out vehemently over the last couple of years and said that he prefers to play power forward. You've had Will Dawkins come out and say that Alex Sarr is our center and Anthony Davis is our power forward. So there's no ifs, ands, or buts. It's pretty clear cut. Davis is starting at the 4. Who backs him up at the forward position, I think, is the bigger discussion. I think that's the best, most exciting battle of training camp because you have 3 pretty distinctly different players that are competing for this role. First, you have Justin Champagnie, who doesn't necessarily do, apart from rebounding, isn't like an incredible offensive player, isn't your, incredible defensive player. he's just as solid as they come. I would always tweet out like Justin Champagnie, solid basketball player, always in the right spots, always making the right plays, always making winning plays. That is what you're getting. You're getting a very solid guy. You know what you're getting in him. He's going to produce on both ends, hold his own on both ends in Champagnie. Really great rebounder as well. Can knock down the three if open, can defend 1 through 4. He's awesome. Okay. The issue is, again, he hasn't necessarily played too much. And even to start last season, and even at times when he should have played, Brian Keefe didn't necessarily give him the runway and the minutes that I think he probably should have gotten. I don't know how much of that had to do with him maybe being too good and the tank being stronger than, the appeal of playing Champagnie. But that's a really solid option. And then you go to the young gun and Will Riley, who is 21 years old and very, very lanky player. He's 6'9", so he's the tallest of these three possible candidates at the backup 4. He can defend 1 through 4. He can play on ball if you want. He can play point guard like minutes. Can get to the rim. You wouldn't know it by just looking at him because he's very skinny, but he was arguably the best rim presence and the best driver on that team over the final 25, 30 games of last season. Not the greatest outside jumper. I think he's about 31%. Champagnie was like 31.9%. So not the best 3-point options. But if you want another, on-ball creator, that's probably your go-to. Not the best probably on the defensive end, though. And when it comes to Chris Middleton, savvy vet, you know what you got from him last season. And I honestly didn't think he played too well in his minutes with the Wizards in most times last season, especially in the clutch. But that's a guy that can operate in the mid-range area, can space the floor from 3 if needed. Probably not the best option in terms of defense and versatility on the defensive end, not his strong suit. I'm not comfortable with him guarding 1s or 2s. 3s and 4s is fine. But I think you kind of have differing play styles between all three. And maybe some nights you'll go with the, rebounding and just the do-it-all-ness of Champagnie. Some nights you'll need another ball handler. Maybe you go with Riley for more offense. And maybe you need more shooting and more, offensive creation and shot creation. You want to go with Middleton. You have options, and that's the best part is the optionality. But that battle for the backup 4 is going to be, I think, heated, and that's the one I'm looking at most. Like, again, I don't know if I see a world where you're playing both Riley and Champagnie off the bench. Maybe that's if Riley is playing backup point. Maybe that's the case for everyone to get those minutes. But that's definitely going to be a battle. And I know a lot of people are kind of counting out Middleton as just like it's just a depth signing. I think he can really push for it. I think he can really compete for that backup 4 spot. And I think that competition between those three is the one I'm eyeing more so than the man versus Carrington, because I think this one is for actual minutes, and the man Carrington one might not necessarily translate into, 15, 20, 25 minutes off the bench per game. Now, after that, the center is pretty easy. I think the center is the most cut and dry one in the entire rotation. Sarr is your starter. DeAndre Ayton is your backup. Tristan Vukcevic is your third string. Quite simple. It'll be different because Tristan won't be back and forth between the G League and the standard roster. He's not on a 2A anymore. So when needed, maybe you need more scoring and like maybe everything's not working. You decide to throw Tristan in for more offense and more, floor spacing. Who knows? But the center one, I think, is pretty easy. And that's kind of a rundown of those competitions. It'll be very interesting to see in a month when training camp begins who starts to emerge. But that level of competition, that optionality that Dawkins has preached, that is the best part about these competitions is no matter what rotation Keefe goes with, 9, 10, 11-man rotation, no matter who starts and who comes off the bench, there's plenty and plenty of options. And I think for this Wizards team, that's certainly a really good thing to have entering what should be a pretty competitive season. Apart from that, there's not much going on until training camp starts. Like I said, be on the lookout for the Wizards signing a 15th standard contract, whether that's Anthony Gill or someone else. Be on the lookout for them trying to fill that final open 2-way spot. And then there's also going to be some training camp deals. Already reported that Alondes Williams will be with the Wizards in training camp. You can have as many as 21 players, I believe, at training camp. And right now the Wizards have 14 standard deals, 2 2-ways. And I know for sure that Alondes is there. So give or take, the last roster spot, the two-way spot, and maybe 2 more camp invites. And that's kind of what you should expect over the next couple of days. Apart from that, that's probably going to do it for this episode of the Wizards podcast. Again, I appreciate all you guys for the continued support and for listening as always.